Welcome back to my YouTube channel, where I continue to share guidance on overcoming panic attacks, obsessive thoughts, constant anxiety, and frightening physical sensations. In short, we're talking about anxiety disorders and practical ways to manage them. This includes psychotherapy techniques, the use of antidepressants, and positive lifestyle changes, all aimed at helping you overcome these challenges as efficiently as possible. I know that each of you has your own story about how your anxiety began and the different ways you've tried to cope with it. I have such a story myself. For a very long time, I found myself trapped in a constant state of intense panic, deep anxiety, and persistent, frightening bodily sensations. This lasted for a little over 10 long years. Pay close attention, a little over 10 long years. That is truly a huge amount of time. Yes, maybe I won't surprise anyone with this fact, because many of you have been in a constant state of anxiety for much longer than that. Long before I ever came to know all about this complex situation, and well before I became a dedicated researcher for myself, before I had acquired professional skills in psychotherapy and advanced teaching, including specific skills in prescribing various medications, and generally before I fully understood how to learn to effectively cope with this, I was standing exactly where you are in your place today. And the thing is, every single person's experience is completely unique and personal, but what ultimately unites them all is this profound sense of suffering, because at its core, living with an anxiety disorder equals immense suffering. You are not actually dying, and you are certainly not going crazy, but you suffer every day just as intensely as if you were truly dying. So, what exactly happened to me back then? I do not really want to look back and remember it or even talk about it. But I have to do it so that you understand you are not alone in your problem and that there are many other people who experience the exact same thing as you. And that truly brings people closer together and gives a certain strength, because a personal example is always very motivating. It all started in 2004. I was just a very young guy back then. I was only 21 years old. I began my first professional job, which, to put it mildly, I really didn't like very much. This was mainly because all young guys, especially those just like me back then, had incredibly high expectations from life, expecting great things right from the start. They weren't based on anything. They were just expectations, youthful ones. A kind of maximalism, so I didn't like the job. That is why every day at work, I always felt very anxious and tense. My anxious and suspicious nature forced me to endure it. Anxious people very often endure things but don't change anything. It's familiar to them. Very often, anxious people had significant problems in their families during early childhood. When your psyche was being formed, starting with my father's alcoholism, I lived in the very epicenter of tension. And that made me constantly feel extremely uncomfortable. As you can imagine, if there was or is alcoholism in your family, it simply can't be a very comfortable environment at home at all. That is, one of the family members poses a threat. Slowly becoming accustomed to such a threat without even realizing it, you start living in a constant state of readiness for battle. I endured the heavy tension, but found myself unable to do anything about it. On top of all that, there were also problems in my personal life where expectations were also far from reality. Problems in the financial sphere. Again, expectations. You're supposed to achieve this, but you end up with something else. And for a person who isn't anxious or ambitious, it's kind of obvious. What do you really expect from a young man who is only 21 years old, that he'll already be a millionaire with a successful life and career? But an anxious person constantly compares their high expectations to reality and simply puts up with what he actually gets. Because what you get isn't what you want. Right now, I'm talking about myself. And so, in 2004, one day after a series of This kind of tension when you come to work and just hate it, when you wake up in the morning and hate the morning because you have to go to work, and living in this kind of mode, I was depleting my own resources, which, as you can imagine, weren't abundant, because in my particular case, there was both a genetic predisposition and an anxious temperament. As you can understand, I had no chance of not being an anxious person. One day I wake up in the morning and suddenly realize I have a really bad headache, which is actually an absolutely normal thing for a person to experience. Well, it hurts quite a lot right now, but I know it'll pass soon enough. Nothing serious, but on the second day, the third, every morning I had headaches. On the fourth day, I wake up once again with a pounding headache, go to wash up, and then suddenly I get a nosebleed. I went into work and stayed there for maybe 30 minutes, certainly no more than that, before I realized that I simply couldn't stay indoors any longer. I look around at my surroundings, and everything is very distorted and incredibly strange. It all feels so very wrong. Someone who hasn't experienced this will never understand. No one who hasn't lived through the daily struggle of constant anxiety and debilitating panic attacks will ever understand what I'm talking about right now. Not even a doctor will ever truly understand. It is honestly quite difficult to explain, and no matter how hard I try to describe it to you right now, it simply won't convey the sheer degree of horror that I felt at that exact moment. I was standing alone in a quiet room and suddenly realized that something was terribly wrong with me, and I couldn't even quite figure out what exactly. Specifically, I wasn't afraid for my body or that something was about to happen to me. I just realized that something was happening to me. I had never before experienced such a profound and unsettling internal sensation, a deeply paralyzing state of absolute fear as I now understand it looking back. But at the time, I didn't fully realize at that moment it was fear. I just had an incredibly powerful and overwhelming impulse to leave that room immediately. I truly didn't understand the reason why I felt that way. For those who don't know what this state is actually like, maybe I'll try to compare it to something much more familiar to you. It's like those first split seconds right before you start vomiting. When you feel an internal wave, a sudden surge deep inside, your throat begins to tighten up, your breathing is interrupted, and there's a spasm in your chest. That's the exact kind of physical state it was. But at the same time, you realize that there's no actual vomiting happening just yet. That's the sensation I'm talking about. And this overwhelming sense of strangeness really scared me. I immediately ran out of the room. And when I ran outside, that's when the full-blown panic attack truly began to take hold. Now I understand that back then it felt like dying. I mean, I was sure that I was dying. I didn't know from what, my heart, or maybe my head, it didn't matter. I knew I was dying. That's how intense the feeling of terror was. If you had asked me at that moment what was wrong, I wouldn't have been able to answer. I just kept saying, I'm dying, that's it. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I was dying. I was 100% sure that something was wrong. I called home and explained that that's it, I'm dying. They came to get me and took me right to the hospital. At the hospital, according to protocol, of course, they measure your blood pressure because that's how they try to figure out what's wrong with a person. Because the doctor sees that I'm pacing back and forth, kind of restless, but clearly not dying. But at the same time, my heart is thumping violently against my chest, and I can't sit still. I simply find it impossible to just sit down and relax. They measured my blood pressure, and at that moment it was 180 over 100. And my pulse was almost 150, and obviously the doctor absolutely had to bring that blood pressure down. And when the doctors prescribed that medication for my high blood pressure, the doctor let slip, it was a haunting phrase that became a deeply personal tragedy for me for almost an entire decade. She turned to her assistant and gave a firm instruction, keep a very close eye on him. What she really meant was that someone had to watch me closely so that I wouldn't suddenly collapse somewhere from that high blood pressure. Back at that time, I didn't even know what blood pressure really was or what it was actually for. I soon realized it was something quite dangerous, and that I could suddenly faint, or even worse, I might even die. Apparently, my blood pressure dropped since they let me leave the medical facility. And from that moment on, I started living by measuring my blood pressure every single day, deeply terrified that it would suddenly spike and kill me. I measured my blood pressure about 50 times a day. That was probably the minimum. Moreover, as you can imagine, when a person is anxious and measures their blood pressure, they actually provoke it themselves. After that, when I measured my blood pressure, which I had triggered myself, it would be around 150, and I would already be feeling anxious and panicked. I kept thinking that it was about to go even higher. They won't be able to lower it in time, or worse, it might go up while I'm asleep and I'll just die from high blood pressure. Back at that time, I didn't even know how something like that was even possible or anything of that nature, but I was honestly really afraid of it. And I tried my very best to prevent my blood pressure from getting high, but the constant anxiety about it actually caused my blood pressure to rise even further. Consequently, the doctors diagnosed me with arterial hypertension and tried their hardest to fight my high blood pressure. I took the prescribed blood pressure medication, but I was completely surprised that my blood pressure still kept spiking unexpectedly. It really didn't matter whether I took the medication or not. My blood pressure just kept going up higher and higher all the time. As you can imagine, I couldn't do any physical exercise. As soon as I got on a bicycle, stepped onto a treadmill, or tried to lift weights, it was absolutely impossible. My heart rate would skyrocket. It would be around 170 to 180, making it impossible to exercise. At first, physical activity would raise both my heart rate and blood pressure. I would get scared by this sensation and all of it. And my heart rate and blood pressure would increase dramatically several times over, and physical activity became impossible. You end up bedridden. You just lie there, trying not to trigger either your heart rate or your blood pressure. That is the fear that I was forced to live with, each day simply to keep myself from dying. At that time, I was absolutely convinced that it was possible. Because the doctor always said that, high blood pressure is very dangerous after all. I started checking my health very carefully. I checked absolutely everything I possibly could, including full blood tests and constant daily blood pressure monitoring. Regular MRI scans, everything that could be checked. To make a long story short, I checked. And here's where the paradox comes in. A person physically healthy dies several times a day, and I got caught in a vicious cycle, anxiety. If before, prior to the onset of panic and anxiety, the things that used to weigh heavily on my mind were my work, my personal life, and the constant stress of financial instability, where every single day I relentlessly tormented my own mind with these thoughts and felt incredibly tense. All of that suddenly became completely irrelevant because a new dominant concern appeared, my condition. As long as the situation remains this severe and challenging, you will never be able to successfully resolve the various problems in your finances, professional career, or daily personal life. It has already become physically impossible. So it turns out that until I completely eliminate this problem, my whole life just begins to crumble and fall apart. And I started carefully monitoring this condition every single day. If before I used to get nervous about those 3 specific concerns, now there's just one, and essentially absolutely nothing has truly changed at all. With this new dominant issue and with these new dominant events, I started worrying dozens of times more intensely than I ever did before. And in doing so, I kept constantly depleting my internal mental resources. So in order for me to finally start, all I needed was just to wake up in the morning, and that was enough to push myself into a panic attack, which unfortunately started happening almost every day. And most often it happened outside. When I stepped outside into the open for some fresh air or for a walk, which I thought was beneficial for my overall physical health at the time, at least so I wouldn't just sit at home, work, or study. Even doing some kind of physical training had already become a significant and daunting challenge. When I went outside, I started experiencing agoraphobia. I would have a panic attack and desperately want to return to the safety of my own home as quickly as possible, where I felt relatively safe. And all of this went on for an incredibly long and exhausting period of time. So long, in fact, that continuing to live like that became completely and utterly impossible to sustain without hospitalization. And I had to go to the hospital. In order to help stabilize and manage my condition with medication, the psychotherapist looked me in the eye and told me that I needed to be hospitalized, because otherwise at home you would just completely wear yourself out and collapse. You're not eating and you're not sleeping properly. Sleeping only a couple of hours every single day, with deep yellow circles under my tired eyes,
Having lost more than 22 lbs,
I desperately needed medication. And this is exactly where another, much more serious story begins. This is the process of selecting medications. A large number of antidepressants simply didn't work for me. I won't go into details now about which specific antidepressants. There were a lot of them. Why didn't they work? Because in my specific case, for some unusual reason, the doctor, perhaps simply because I was so young at the time, decided not to use any tranquilizers. The primary concern was that I might eventually become dependent on them, especially since my father had struggled with alcoholism. By affecting my brain with these tranquilizers, there was a significant risk I could get hooked on these drugs and then start to take them willingly, which wouldn't be entirely safe for me at all. And looking back, that was a major mistake because I wasn't able to start taking my antidepressants in a proper way. I was shaking, I was vomiting, I kept needing to go to the bathroom, I couldn't sleep, I was just walking around thinking only about when I would finally feel better. My head felt squeezed and my blood pressure was fluctuating even more than it had before I went to the hospital. So, for me personally, the hospital felt like a terrifying kind of hell where I was constantly suffering, almost as if cruel demons were roasting me over a hot fire day and night. And then, right at that specific moment, when they finally started administering a small dosage of various tranquilizers, I began to feel quite a bit better and was able to start taking antidepressants. But the thing is, even after I was eventually discharged from the hospital, I strictly continued with the regimen of taking those antidepressants. And then, following my doctor's recommendation, I stopped taking them after 8 months. As soon as I stopped, my condition would immediately return. It would even come back with renewed strength. Why? Because all my hope was placed on the antidepressants. The doctor told me that this antidepressant would cure me, fix my serotonin problem, and everything would finally return to the way it was before. But as soon as I stopped taking the antidepressant, everything got bad again, and even worse than before. Moreover, I'll tell you, with my condition, with my anxiety and hypercontrol, I never actually experienced remission in my entire life. Even while taking the antidepressant, I couldn't say that I was in remission or that I felt good. No, there was always something bothering me. While I was taking antidepressants, my appetite improved and I didn't have that constant round-the-clock anxiety anymore. However, there were still physical sensations, such as stomach pain, headaches, or back pain. There were still many manifestations of my anxiety. They were just appearing in a different form. It just shifted more into the body rather than chronic anxiety. I wouldn't say it was better or worse, it was just different. Moreover, on antidepressants, my emotions weren't quite the same as before. Even if it was a good day, the sun was shining, and my mood was more or less okay. That joy wasn't the same as it was before antidepressants. It was as if everyday life constantly felt as though it was being experienced through a thick plastic bag. It's like you can see, you can hear, and you can touch, but every single thing feels incredibly strange and a little distorted. To put it in another way, there was always a mild degree of derealization and depersonalization. And then my disorder changed direction. If before it was constant panic attacks and the anxious anticipation of those attacks, so you would be at home just waiting, and then the sudden attack would happen when you were outside. Or when you would push yourself into that state at home and then there would be a drop. So death, survival, survival. And this went on for many, many months, you see. The person was a hostage to their own disorder. During the period of taking antidepressants, over time as well, you understand, this went on for years. one antidepressant would last for a couple of months, then another for a couple of months, then a third. And this went on like that constantly for many years. So the disorder slowly and steadily changed its direction. Instead of a classic panic disorder, it took on a completely different form. Specifically, a persistent form of anxiety about various bodily sensations. When you worry about your heart, it often beats very fast. If a normal person has a heart rate of 60 beats per minute, mine was 90 to 100. That's not normal. And you keep going, constantly getting your heart checked. For several months, you're focused on the problem with your cardiovascular system. Then, somehow, it all goes away. The doctors reassure you that everything is fine. After some time, you start getting headaches. They torment you for months until you get checked out. You absolutely had to get an MRI, and they told you there was no tumor. You're healthy in this regard. And then it would let go. After that, everything would shift to your stomach. After the stomach, it would move to your intestines, then from your intestines to your urinary system, and you'd end up running to the bathroom dozens of times a day. And all of this went on for many, many long and difficult months. This behavior eventually becomes deeply ingrained, and you turn into a constantly hyper-aware walking monitor of your own internal organs. You start to notice even the slightest, most subtle changes, absolutely any at all. As you can imagine, such hypersensitivity significantly alters your sensitivity threshold, and you start to experience sensations that you usually wouldn't notice. But things that another person who doesn't have an anxiety disorder simply wouldn't notice. Then I shifted my focus to psychotherapy, and there I encountered a particularly significant problem as well. One that persisted for several years. It's the search for a supposed cause, because an anxiety disorder must have some kind of reason behind it. As a matter of fact, one of the psychotherapists told me that since you had such a destructive childhood and major problems, you really need to restore your relationship with your father, because at that time they were already divorced, in order to somehow begin to improve your mental condition. I did that. It didn't help. Absolutely nothing has changed in my condition. Then there were psychotherapists, and not just one. He was just one of them. There could have been other specialists later, and then they say, well, you have problems because you dwell on things too much, because you're not married. You haven't gone through certain life stages that you need to, and once you do, you'll forget about all this. All right, I solved that problem too. I got married, but nothing went away either. The next psychotherapist said, well, listen, the next stage is having a child. You don't have kids, so you're still focused on yourself. You need to move on to this stage. Most likely, everything will go away then. I was already doubting this because it seemed very strange. When I was 21, I wasn't thinking about these things, and I already had the problem. And now, for some reason, the absence of a child became the cause of my anxiety disorder. It doesn't matter. I had a son. And the condition didn't go away. I would even say that in some ways it got worse. Because when you have a small child, you get sleepless nights, extra stress, and for someone with an anxiety disorder, you're already sleep deprived. And on top of that, life changes call for a certain responsibility and new challenges. As you can imagine, did it get easier? It didn't. Next stage. You need to change your job. You don't like your job, so you need to move towards what you truly enjoy. I switched jobs like changing gloves because my psychotherapist convinced me that I needed to strive for what I liked, although in reality that wasn't quite the whole truth. As you might easily imagine, changing my professional field did not actually lead to any progress at all, because I always carried my sense of anxiety with me and brought it to every single new job. Sometimes in therapy, I would complain about the place where I lived, about the very town I lived in. I didn't really like it, and I was always longing for something much more. And yet another psychotherapist convinced me that I just needed to move away and things would get easier. As you can see, I wasn't just changing cities. I was relocating to different countries. I could be dealing with an anxiety disorder, having to take medication somewhere, and at the very same time, moving to another country entirely. Can you imagine how determined I was? and how much I believed that simply relocating or changing my profession would somehow magically cure my anxiety. Of course, all of that was a total and absolute fabrication and completely untrue. And it was the pinnacle of sheer incompetence in solving such problems. But one day when I went to yet another psychotherapist, I once again started complaining about how I was feeling. At that time, it had changed as well. It seemed like I wasn't having panic attacks every single day anymore, but the sensations didn't go away. Those bodily sensations were the hardest thing I had to overcome. And if you're physically healthy, then it means you're not mentally healthy. And thoughts started to appear like, what if you go insane or do something to yourself, can't take it anymore, and end up doing something to yourself? And because of that, panic attacks would also happen when you pushed yourself to the point where you felt crazy and like no one understood you. And then there was the next one, who at that particular time was the very last psychotherapist I ever went to see. And they said something to me that seemed completely and utterly stupid to me back then. But looking back now, I realized that it was the most decisive and important advice of my entire life. He told me then that nothing is helping you, neither psychotherapy nor medication, so you truly need to find your own unique path forward. And right there in his office, I almost burst into tears. I felt so completely defenseless. I sat there staring directly at him, wanting to insult him and walk out. Even though the session had just started, literally only about 15 minutes or so had passed. During our long conversation, I suddenly stood up and said, "Well, goodbye. I'll go look for my own path." Then I turned around and left. From that moment on, I didn't go to see any more psychotherapists. I was deeply offended by him at the time, but later I realized I truly had no other choice. Either die, live with it, or somehow find a way to recover. By fundamentally transforming my entire way of living, I changed. I underwent a total and comprehensive shift in my approach to physical activity, nutrition, and my daily lifestyle. Having extensively studied the specific techniques of cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and various modern approaches to psychopharmacology. Even back then, I was already beginning to understand how everything works, and that no one would ever give me clear answers on how to get rid of it, because no one really knows. Everything is very individual for each person, and going to a psychotherapist to dig deep into your childhood or whatever else there might be. You won't have enough time or money in your life. And that's why I took from the various types of psychotherapy that I mentioned above the most effective techniques available. I also took from physical exercise and from certain supplements as well. Whatever works, whatever helps me become stronger and more resilient both psychologically and physically. I eventually realized that the core problem was my naturally anxious nature. I realized that the problem was in my beliefs and expectations. It was necessary to work with my actual state, with the expectations of recovery that never came, and to accept what you cannot change. Yes, sometimes I had to use medication to improve my appetite or to get my sleep back on track. But at the same time, I no longer relied on it because I understood that it wouldn't cure me. It's impossible to cure your character. Any medication is a crutch. It will help you move forward. Like a cast. You broke your leg. A cast will help you recover. But after that, you need to train the limb. Isn't that right? You have to learn to run and jump again, but in a new way so you don't get injured again. And I learned how to do that, which is what I wish for all of you as well. Wishing you strong health, both emotional and physical. Please continue to watch my channel. And I hope that very soon you will see. We'll also get rid of your panic attacks, obsessive thoughts, anxiety, and frightening physical sensations. Bye-bye.